Hope everyone is healthy, and we're at the end of 2020. This is, I think, one year when everyone's going to be happy to get over with. So I will certainly be myself. I look forward to teaching live and visiting you all live in Boca. So hopefully the previous classes we did were basically back-to-back classes: World Perfect, Jewish Impact on Civilization, and the why the Jews, the why of anti-Semitism. We're going to now do, for the remainder of the series, 4 classes that are sort of interrelated with each other. I call this the Jew in the Modern World series, and each of them stands on its own. So if you miss one, it's certainly not the end of the world, although it's a great thing to see together because they kind of go in a thematic and chronological order. And we say modern world, we're not talking about, my kids, it's funny, they think anything before 1990 is ancient. When you have a history that's almost 4,000 years old, modern is the last 300-400 years. But we're still living in, even though much of this is focused on hundreds of years ago, it still reverberates through the world today and through the Jewish world today. So the first class we're going to do is on the Enlightenment and its impact. And then we're going to do a class, God willing, on the Reform movement in Germany. Very interesting topic, and conservative, and not so much on the differences theologically, but the history of the movements and what we learn from them. Then we're going to do a class on Zionism and Judaism, focusing more on Eastern Europe. And finally, a class that I think puts it all together in terms of modern Jewish identity, which is universalism versus particularism, which is one of the big issues confronting not just the Jewish people today, but the whole world today. And more on that as we get to it. I'm going to attempt to share my screen yet again with you guys. We're going to try and do the advanced version. And hopefully here we go. And hopefully this will work. We just tested and it worked fine. So let's see if this works. And here we go. Oh, Eureka. I like this because you can see me in the front of the screen. It's almost as if I'm on a stage talking to you guys. So before we get into the topic of Jewish identity and the Enlightenment, we have to give the bigger picture. We have to deal with what's called big history, which is looking at what's going on in the world during this period of time that we call the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is also known as the Age of Reason, and it's a period of time that's going to go from basically 1650 to 1850. And we're talking about the Enlightenment, and we're talking specifically about Western Europe. And this is when Western Europe is going to emerge. If our history of European history, we go from the classical period of Greece and Rome, and then in the 5th century, the Roman Empire in the West comes to an end. We then go into a period called the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, where religion was the central focus in people's identity in Western Europe. A lot of the countries we have today in Europe didn't exist. It was Christendom, that you were part of a larger Christian world. From there, we go from 1350 to 1650 into the Renaissance, or the Renaissance, depending on how you pronounce it. And that's sort of the rediscovery of the classical knowledge and worldview of Greece and Rome, much more humanistic, because the Renaissance, the Middle Ages was very focused on otherworldliness, the feudal system. This world, life is difficult for most people, but it'll be good in the next world. And religious identity was really central. When you get to the Renaissance, that's going to move away towards a period of time focusing more on the individual and the great culture that comes out of the Renaissance, especially in Italy. And then from 1650 to 1850, we're going to go into what's called the Enlightenment. The Age of Reason is another name for that period of time. And the focus of that period of time is going to be very different. And out of that, we're going to get the modern world of today. Here's a few personalities you might be familiar with, who are some of the major I got to get out of the way there. Some of the major personalities of the Enlightenment: Sir Isaac Newton, scientifically; John Locke, the father of liberalism; Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the great thinker; Voltaire, the great French intellectual; Adam Smith, economics; Baruch Spinoza, a Jew, but very influential in terms of Enlightenment thinking; Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher; Thomas Jefferson, the architect of the Declaration of Independence and much of the political thought of the United States; and many other personalities. Famous personalities were around in that period of time, many of whom had very ostentatious hairstyles and wigs. I love the wigs. But the whole focus of this period of time, unlike 1,000 years ago, where it was all on religion and being part of, my religious identity and faith, we're talking about Christian world, the Enlightenment was focusing on rationalism and nationalism primarily. Rationalism meaning universal principles and laws of science can govern humanity. Very optimistic period of time. Nationalism meaning my identity is no longer maybe part of a Christian world, but part of a citizen of a nation state with certain rights and responsibilities. And even the nation states such as Germany and Italy, which were basically multiple city states that were not united for a long period of time, even as we get to the end of the age of Enlightenment, even these countries will finally emerge as nation states. The question is, what's going to be the impact of this change? Because we Jews, now most of us are probably from Eastern European ancestry, the Ukraine, the White Russia, the Russian Empire. So this may not have directly affected our ancestors because the majority of Jews were not living in Western Europe, but the impact of the Enlightenment will spread and ripple throughout history and will pose to us individually and collectively certain questions about our identity that until today we Jews have to deal with, but certainly back then will have a massive impact on Jewish self-identity and Jewish continuity. The most important event probably of the Enlightenment would be, I would say, the French Revolution. Here you can see 1789 to 1799. Initially, it starts, for those of you who know your French history, with the overthrow of, they have the famous image of the siege of the Bastille, which was like a prison in Paris. The siege of the Bastille, it leads to the toppling of the monarch of France, who's Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. There you can see a picture of everyone should be sure to please mute themselves, mute the mics. There you see an image of Louis XVI being beheaded, as was Marie Antoinette. By the way, the French Revolution will degenerate into a reign of terror, in which thousands of people will be executed on the guillotines. But the French Revolution will also introduce into Western thinking, shattering the more feudal concepts of nobility and introducing, a different idea about government and rights and responsibilities of the individuals within the country. At least in theory, it started out as a good idea. Again, it didn't necessarily end so well. And Jews will, living in France, for the first time, actually benefit from a major political upheaval in that France will be the first country in 1791 to actually grant Jews civil rights. This is something we don't appreciate because y'all live in the United States. There's no yellow stars you have to wear, no ghettos you have to live in, no special taxes you have to pay. You're citizens, you get to vote, you have the same rights, privileges, and responsibilities as anyone else. This is not something that existed for Jews of Europe for well over a millennia, where we were living as at the largesse, as they say, at the whim of the king or the local bishop or the local lord. We could be expelled at will. We had no rights. We were considered often property of nobility or kings or a local religious leader. You can see over here, I actually have for your perusal, there you can see the French National Assembly, 1791. This is a huge thing. The National Assembly, considering that the conditions requisite to be a French citizen and to become an active citizen are fixed by the Constitution, that every man who, being duly qualified, takes the civic oath and engages to fulfill the duties prescribed by the Constitution, has a right to all the advantages it ensures, meaning the citizenship is now opened up to the population at large, provided you meet your responsibilities, annuls all adjournments, restrictions, and exceptions contained in the preceding decrees affecting individuals of the Jewish persuasion who shall take the civic oath. And again, Jews were subject to any number of discriminatory pieces of legislation, special taxes, forced, economically marginalized, physically marginalized. And now, in theory, it didn't happen overnight. The walls of the ghettos are going to come down and Jews are going to be granted citizenship. And this is going to pose a huge challenge for us. But what's most interesting is if you know your French history, France will go from the Revolution 1789 to the Reign of Terror. By the way, European monarchs, just as they are today, are largely intermarried. the purpose of most marriages in the history of almost all civilizations and empires is very rarely for love and almost always to keep power and wealth centralized in a few people. Keep marrying your cousins, and all that money and all that power stays in a few families, and that's how it was. So European monarchs did not particularly like the fact that their cousins were being beheaded in France, in Paris. It's a bad precedent to set, because it could start with them and then could spread to Prussia and Germany and Italy and who knows where else is going to end up losing their head. So France, in addition to all the internal political turmoil and the reign of terror, is also fighting a war with a coalition of European powers who are very unhappy with France. It's during this chaos that Napoleon Bonaparte will rise to power. By the way, he will originally start out as a French artillery officer. He will even lead an invasion of the Middle East. He takes the city of Jaffa, tries to take Akko. It's a famous story. He's not successful, but he will rise from being a Corsican artillery officer in the French army to seizing control of France and becoming the emperor in 1803. Now, believe it or not, the great champion of Jewish emancipation will be Napoleon Bonaparte. When he is traveling throughout Europe on his amazing military campaign that we'll talk about later, and he's remarkably successful. He may have been small in stature, but he was great in his genius and his ego for sure, and his aggressive genius as a military commander, fighting multiple. You can read all about the Battle of Austerlitz or Friedland. Napoleon was quite good on land. He didn't fare so well at sea, especially against the British. But as he's going through Europe, he's encountering different European cities that still have these ghettos. And you can actually see, this is a picture of the Eugen over here, which was burnt to the ground in a fire. It no longer stands. I've been to Frankfurt. This is the Jewish ghetto in Frankfurt where the Rothschilds, we'll talk about them later, will come out of. But he will come across the miserable living conditions that Jews were forcibly confined to, again, physically confined to, not let out of. At night you were locked in the ghettos. The overcrowding was incredible in places like the Judengasse in Frankfurt. They would limit the community to 11 weddings a year to keep the population down. There were 36 special taxes that Jews had to pay. A tax to be born, a tax to die, a tax for marriage, a tax for circumcision, a tax for weddings, a tax for kosher meat, a tax for kosher wine, a tax for Shabbat candles, a tax for wearing a head covering, a tax for not serving in the German army, which even if you wanted to serve in the army, not pay the tax, that wasn't a choice for you. It was like a lose-lose. You want to know how so many Jews got into economics and being accountants? It was probably figuring out how to outsmart all of these ridiculous pieces of legislation. But Napoleon was genuinely horrified by what he saw in the condition of the Jews. And he will literally break the walls of the ghettos down as he advances in his military campaign throughout Europe. And you can see, here's a series of statements made by Napoleon. It's interesting where I found a lot of these. The head of the World Napoleonic Society was a guy by the name of Bill Weeder. His brother, Joe Weeder, I'm sure neither of them are alive today. Joe Weeder was the guy who did all the weightlifting equipment you might be familiar with if you buy gym equipment. They're two Jewish brothers from Montreal, and he was a sycophantic lover of Napoleon. He ran the World Napoleonic Society. I got some really interesting quotes from him and had some very interesting interactions with him like 20 years ago about Napoleon and what he thought about him. But look what Napoleon writes. My policy is to govern men as the great majority of them wish to be governed. If I were governing Jews, I should rebuild the Temple of Solomon. I plan to revive among the Jews the sentiment of civic morality that unfortunately have been morbid among too large a number of them by the state of abasement in which they have long languished. Meaning, by raising the Jew up, and look at this really romanticized. There's Napoleon. Look at him as the emperor with his like Caesar-like crown on and his robes. And here's like the menorah and the rabbis and all the Jews at his feet. It's a great picture. Part of his very large ego. I'm sure he loved this kind of stuff. But he said that the Jews have been so debased and so put down that their notion of any civic responsibility being part of a greater nation of the French people, it can't happen until we raise them up. A very noble sentiment, by the way, way, way far advanced of what any political leader was thinking at the time regarding the Jews. Look at this quote. My desire is to make Jews equal citizens in France. Now remember, Jews were already technically equal citizens. have a conciliation between their religion and their responsibilities in becoming French, and to answer all the accusations made against them. I want all people living in France to be equal citizens and to benefit from our laws. So his desire was to raise up the Jews economically and in their terms of their collective self-worth, and make them active, constructive participants in greater French society. It seems to be a very noble cause. He's not a man of just talk. He will actually in 1806 convene an assembly of Jewish notables. And in 1807, he'll make what's called the Great Sanhedrin in Paris, where he puts 100 rabbis in the room. Now, keep in mind, in 1807, there are only Orthodox rabbis. There's no Reconstructionist, Reform, or Conservative movement. We'll get to those later in a further class. And he asks these rabbis a series of questions because he's testing the waters to see, is it even possible for Jews who have their own laws, their own lifestyle, to become loyal citizens of a country? And I want to show you some of the questions, not all of them. I have a great book I found. It's called Critical Documents. No, excuse me, The Jew in the Modern World. The editors are Pierre Mendes Flohr and Yehuda Reinhardt. Yehuda Reinhardt was also the president of Brandeis University, and it's a great collection of primary source material. If any of you are thinking of being even amateur historians, you have to learn to go to the original sources, because otherwise you're reading what historians say about it. And one of my favorite quotes about history is, not even God can change history, only historians can. So the fun part of being a historian is to go to the sources, look what the people what comes out of their own mouths, and formulate your own opinions about it. So I want to show you a couple. I have the entire document I took out of this book. I'm not going to read the whole thing, it takes too long, but just a little snippet of it. But I want you to be asking yourselves, when I'm reading this quote, I want you to ask yourselves, what is the one question Napoleon is really asking via the rabbis, the Jewish people? So here's a little excerpt of the questions. The wish of His Majesty, this is Count Molé, who was sent by Napoleon to address these 100 rabbis. The wish of His Majesty is you should be Frenchmen. It remains with you to accept the proffered title. You will hear the questions submitted to you. Your duty is to answer the whole truth, every one of them. Guys, please make sure you're muted. Someone's not muted. Your duty is to answer the whole truth on every one of them. Is divorce valid when not pronounced by courts of justice and by virtue of laws in contradiction with the French code? Can a Jewess, that's a Jewish woman, marry a Christian, or a Jew a Christian woman? In the eyes of Jews, are Frenchmen considered as brethren or as strangers? Do the Jews born in France and treated by the law as French citizens consider France as their country? What kind of police jurisdiction have the rabbis among the Jews? So ask yourself now, what is the real question Napoleon's asking? Think about it. Now, if you were alive, I'd be asking you to pipe up and answer. But it seems to me the question he's asking is, exactly, very good, loyalty. From iPad 5 to everyone. Loyalty, exactly, that's the question. Where is your primary loyalty? This is not, again, and this was a new question for us. We never had the option of choosing. We were always, whether we liked it or not, even if we were told you're Jewish, we were reminded we're Jewish. In medieval Europe, Jews had to wear the circle coin sign we saw in the Why the Jews presentation. For those of you who joined in the last class, you had to walk around wearing a stupid Jewish hat. You were humiliated. So this was a unique opportunity and challenge. Now, the rabbis, by the way, I learned a great lesson from this interaction. If you're ever asked a question on which your future or your life depends, take time and don't jump to the answer. They're really trapped between a rock and a hard place. Think about it. On one hand, these are no Orthodox rabbis. They have a loyalty to Torah and the commandments, and they can't just say, yeah, throw it out the window. Now the beautiful thing about halacha, by the way, is it deals with everything in all situations, and there are specific halachic discussions in Jewish law about balancing. We're not going to go into it now. Maybe you can ask Rabbi Moskowitz to do a class on this. There's a thing called Dine de Malchusa Kedine, the laws of the land of a country in which you are being hosted by. And by the way, to just give a very interesting little thought on that, it largely depends on how the host country treats you, whether they're treating you fairly or not. And if they're treating you fairly, your obligations towards the host country are very different from when they're openly discriminating against you. So now French Jewry is being offered to be treated fairly, provided they are willing to demonstrate a certain level of loyalty and commitment to their host country. So these rabbis took a while to answer. They took many days. When they finally answered, I want to show you the answers now, or part of the answers. These guys did a great job. I don't think I've ever seen rabbis talk so much and say so little. Actually, unfortunately, I have heard a few rabbis giving sermons who talked a lot and said very little. But they did a great job of dancing around this question. And here's a snippet of the answer, very interesting. The only marriages expressly forbidden by the laws are those with by the law are those with the 7 Canaanite nations, with Ammon and Moab, and with the Egyptians. The prohibition in general applies only to nations in idolatry. The Talmud declares formally that modern nations are not to be considered as such, since they worship like us the God of heaven and earth, and accordingly there have been at several periods intermarriage between Jews and Christians in France, in Spain, and in Germany. But we cannot deny that the opinion of the rabbis is against these marriages. Huh. So how's that for yeah, no, but really we don't want to offend you because the prohibition is about pagans, but the point is it worked. The Jews were already emancipated. Keep in mind that was in 1791. But it worked in that the gates of the ghettos come down, and how do Jews run to embrace this? And this is going to prove to be a massive challenge that is in modern history the Jews had not had to deal with. The last time we had to deal with this issue would be at the time of Hanukkah, 2,200 years ago, when Greek culture came to the land of Israel. So there's nothing, this isn't a new topic, but it resurfaces 2,000 years later. And the big question is exactly that question. What will be your primary identity? What will be your primary loyalty? And I put a French flag up there because that's the issue. This is not meant to be an Israeli flag. It's more a symbol of Judaism. I probably should have put menorah up there instead. But that's the issue we have to deal with today. I mean, think about it. If you if you're walking around somewhere in Florida, and there's a lot of Jews in Florida, I think Dade, Broward counties have, in the United States, I think it's New York, and then probably Florida and LA are about the same number of Jews. So you bump into an Orthodox Jewish man on the street and stick a microphone in his face and say, "Excuse me, sir, could you tell me a little bit about yourself and who you are?" Start with a few adjectives to describe who you are. And I'll say, "I'm an American, I'm a Floridian," but I can promise you, out of an observant Jewish person's mouth, one of the first 3 to 5 things will be, "I'm Jewish." If you stop a disconnected, assimilated Jew or a Jew of minimum affiliation, the word Jew may not come up at all. I was born Jewish, I don't identify as such. But that is largely a byproduct of exactly what is going on in this period of time, going back to the late 18th and early 19th century. How will we deal with that identity, and how do we meet this new challenge? Because we've been in many situations as Jews. You know, as a Jewish historian, I could tell you we've lived all over the world pretty much, and in varying degrees of freedom and servitude, and varying degrees of wealth and prosperity, and poverty and oppression. And I can tell you that history shows that the hardest situation for Jews to live in has not been the situation of persecution, oppression, and poverty. Trust me, when our great-great-grandparents lived in the Tsarist Russian Empire amidst often very anti-Semitic Eastern Europeans in poverty and oppression, with pogroms coming through the little shtetls every couple times a year, this wasn't a big problem for assimilation. You know, our great-great-grandparents' children didn't play with, Ivan and Boris's children, unless it was Catch and Beat the Christ Killer or some other horrible game. There was tremendous separation of these communities, generally speaking, and a lot of animus directed towards them. But when we get to a situation of a Jew in the modern world, and we live in a nice part of the world, like in Boca Raton, Florida, or New York, a nice suburb, and you live with perfectly wonderful non-Jewish neighbors, and there's no special Jew taxes, no ghettos, no restrictions, you're not locked out of any restaurants, universities, or hospitals, and your 17-year-old son thinks your very nice next door neighbor's 15-year-old blonde-haired, blue-eyed, not Jewish daughter is very beautiful. This proves to be, unfortunately, a much greater challenge for us historically than the greatest anti-Semites in human history. And I am not exaggerating that. I don't want to do it now, but I can make a very good case to show you that more Jews have disappeared in the last 75 years since the Holocaust, statistically, than Hitler was able to kill off in the Holocaust. Being loved to death by the larger world has proven to be a much more traumatic and difficult experience for us to do. And by the way, I'm not saying this is a zero-sum game at all. No one should get me wrong about that. But it's proved to be a big challenge, and we're going to talk about that as we go along. And in the next few classes, we're going to address different aspects of it, especially in the next class. By the way, this is great just to share with you. This is interesting. This is, I know in American prayer books, if you get, even Orthodox prayer books have this for sure. It's in Art Scroll, I think, has it. I know for sure that the Koran one has a prayer for the state in which you live, and a prayer for the leader. I remember in England, they have one for Queen Elizabeth. This is one, if you look over here, this is a copy. It says, Napoleon Hagadol. This is in a Jewish prayer book, Orthodox prayer book, praying for Napoleon, that he should do well and he should, rule over us with wisdom and clarity and show kindness to the Jewish people. So it's an interesting idea that this has also been incorporated, the notion of how we show loyalty and respect, even in religious services, towards the countries and governments in which we live, for dealing with us kindly and fairly. But anyway, let's go back to Napoleon for a minute. Now, Napoleon, by the way, will rise to power in 1803. He will lead a brilliant military campaign, fighting these battles that I mentioned, Austerlitz and Friedland and all these other battles. He will eventually, in 1812, make it all the way out with a very large army of almost 500,000 men to Russia. The Battle of Borodino, which is where the 1812 overture, Tchaikovsky wrote, and the battle, by the way, was fought to an inconclusive end. But the Russians will abandon Moscow, and Napoleon will occupy Moscow. But he can't just sit there. Armies can't just sit in places. And eventually the city will, by the way, largely burn down to fire. Napoleon will abandon the city and head back to France in the winter, which will prove to be a disaster. And he will end up losing 90% of his army. He will, we'll get back to it in a minute, but it's interesting. As Napoleon is advancing towards the Battle of Borodino, confronting Russia. And remember, Tsarist Russian Empire, and this we'll talk about 2 classes from now when we get to the Zionism class, but the vast majority of Jews in the early 19th century already, and certainly by the late 19th century, which is a little later on, will be living under Tsarist Russian persecution. And there are only 2 kinds of czars. There's bad czars and worse czars. Remember Tevye the milkman and Fiddler on the Roof? His blessing that he gives to the czar. May God bless and keep the czar far away from us. So Tsarist Russia was hell for Jews already by this period of time. You had Jews being forcibly drafted into the young Jewish children at the age of 12 being drafted for 25 years into the Tsarist Russian army. You had persecution and pogroms and Jews economically, physically marginalized. It was terrible. So here comes Napoleon Bonaparte marching to defeat the Tsar. And we know what's going to happen to the Jews if Napoleon is victorious. There's going to be emancipation. So we Jews are big believers that God runs the world, and we believe in prayer as a powerful force, individually and collectively. So before major events, you pray. So, and we also believe that you ask rabbis for direction. So Eastern European Jewry, which was to a large extent very connected Jewishly still, will ask their rabbis, who should we pray for? Should we pray for the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas, or should we go pray for Napoleon to win the battle? And it seems like a no-brainer. Of course, pray for Napoleon. The reality is it wasn't exactly that. I want to show you. This is a great quote this is Shneur Zalman of Liadi. He's the founder of the Chabad movement, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. Okay, there's been 7 of them, I believe. He's the first. He said, look what he writes. Should Napoleon be victorious, wealth amongst the Jews will be abundant, but the hearts of Israel will be separated and distant from their Father in heaven. But if our master Alexander, I got the Tsar wrong, it wasn't Nicholas, it was Alexander. There's a lot of them with the same name. If our master Alexander will triumph, though poverty will be abundant, the heart of Israel will be bound and joined with their Father in heaven. And for God's sake, burn this letter. I love that. Like, don't forget to delete your emails. It's funny that the letter wasn't burned because we have it in front of us. This is not something you want falling into the hands of the wrong people. But what Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi is saying is exactly what I was talking about. First of all, we know that it's human nature that people tend to pray. It says in the Bible, you know, you're going to eat and you'll be fat and you know, the land will give its produce and you'll eat and you'll forget about me, God says. You know, no atheists in the foxholes. When there's a drought, we pray to God. When the rain falls and the wheat grows and there's plenty of bread in the supermarket, we tend to forget about them. And we tend to forget about our Judaism. And this is exactly the point. As weird as it seems and as counterintuitive as it seems, Schneur Zalman realized that Napoleon was going to unleash forces of assimilation. And by the way, this was not outside the purview of what Napoleon wants to accomplish. Look at this other statement made by Napoleon. I will never accept any proposal that will obligate the Jewish people to leave France, because for me, the Jews are the same as any other citizens in our country. It takes weakness to chase them out of the country, but it takes strength to assimilate them. And that's exactly what's going to take place, unfortunately. As the walls, not for Jews in Eastern Europe, because Napoleon doesn't stick around long enough. And until the mid-19th century, even the peasants of Tsarist Russia are still considered the property of the landed nobility. So the Enlightenment actually has yet to come to Russia, in my opinion. They went from Tsarism to communism to Putinism now. But for the Jews of Western Europe, Jews are, even by the late 19th century, I think the last country to give Jews citizenship, I believe, is either Spain or Switzerland, and that doesn't take place till the early 20th century. Full citizenship isn't given to, I think, Jews of Spain until then. Actually, Jews were not allowed technically to live in Spain until 1992, when King Juan Carlos, who's no longer king, he abdicated, officially rescinded the expulsion order from 1492. But the walls of the ghettos come down, the restrictions are lifted, and what do Jews run to do? They run out of the ghettos largely. And by the way, we're going to see a lot of them in Eastern Europe. We're going to run to the Golden Medina in America, where the same phenomenon was going to take place, because there's no Jewish infrastructure in the United States really to speak of. The heart of the Jewish world spiritually is going to be in Eastern Europe, not in the Western world in America. That's very much a post-World War II phenomenon, which we'll get to in a later talk. But Jews will basically run to assimilate, not necessarily overnight, but they will start to leave their Judaism behind out of a desire to either be lured into or a desire to engage in Western European culture, and often feeling that my Judaism is somehow, or my staying loyal to my Judaism will somehow be an impediment to that, or just being lured into the allure of the very lightened world of Western Europe, which in Western Europe in the 19th century, especially mid-19th century, till World War I, was a great place to live in general. There was, especially the last few decades, there was peace and prosperity and technology and democracy was taking over and everything was getting better, and Jews wanted to be part of that world. And now Jews could do things like go to university, something Jews could not do. Literally for centuries, they could join trade guilds and become professionals and join armies, and Jews run to do all of that. I mean, for hundreds of years, Jewish mothers couldn't say my son or daughter the doctor. This is serious nachas, deprivation. And that's exactly what Jews will do. And the reaction of Jews is quite interesting. And we're going to see this little graph, this little picture I made in a couple of different classes. This is Western Europe, responses to emancipation. So TO means Torah observant. I don't call them Orthodox because that's a term that we'll see only comes into use a little bit later on. It's a term actually invented by the Reform movement to label observant Jews. But some Jews will just try and maintain their level of Jewish observance and religiosity. But we'll have several moves to the left, so to speak. I'm not talking about political left. But we're going to have the Reform movement, which is an attempt to create a version of Judaism which will allow Jews to comfortably fit, more comfortably fit into European civilization in general, and Germany specifically. That is such an important topic. We have to do a whole separate class on that because it's really, really important, really interesting and insightful. We're going to have Jews who are just going to be like unaffiliated, secular. They're going to be Jew in name alone, but not in affiliation, giving up any level of observance or affiliation. And then you're going to have conversions. You're going to have 250,000 conversions in the 19th century in Western Europe. And the vast majority of them will not be done out of a suddenly discovery that we want Jesus in our life. Very, very few of them will come out of that. Most of them will come out of more practical considerations, because we'll see that while the walls of the ghettos may have come down, and in theory there were no restrictions on the books, it's one thing to be guaranteed freedom by law, it's another thing to get it in practice. And depending on which country you live in, there will be high levels of discrimination on many different levels. Like Jews being able to, in Germany, could go to university, but it will take them many more decades to be professors. In Germany, we'll see also to join the army was allowed much earlier on. And Jews, by the way, will run in these European countries. What's the best way to show a country, well, now that you're offering me citizenship, provided I demonstrate my loyalty. So what's the best way to demonstrate loyalty? Join the army. Jews will run off and join the armies of all these countries. Now you can show, now I can demonstrate that I'm willing to die for my host country. But in a place like Germany, they can join the army, but it's not until World War I where they'll be able to actually be officers in the army. I mentioned in the previous class, by the way, that Adolf Hitler, who fought in World War I, got his first Iron Cross, his German military award, from his Jewish commanding officer in World War I. There'll be many restrictions keeping Jews from advancing political careers. Now Jews can vote, and they could, in theory, be parts of governments, but it was one thing in theory, but another thing in practice. A couple of great examples of this, of how Jews are dealing with this, a few famous examples, is one is Heinrich Heine. Heinrich Heine is probably the most important person in the 19th century in German literature. His real name was Henry or Chaim Heine. And in 1825, he will convert to Lutheranism, become a German Protestant. And he writes, and he wrote the title of this essay is called My Ticket to Western Civilization. And it really lets you into what's going on in his brain. He says, from the nature of my thinking, you can deduce that baptism is a matter of indifference to me, that I do not regard it as important, even symbolically. He says, I don't care about being Christian. The baptism certificate is a ticket of admission to European culture. That's exactly the point. If you wanted to make it to the highest levels of culture in Europe, and especially in Germany, which was the ultimate high level of culture, then people would convert to further their careers. They just leave their Judaism behind and become Heinrich Heine. Of course, he's not around when Hitler's around, but what do you think one of the first books that Hitler was going to burn is? As soon as Hitler knows that Heinrich Heine is a Jew, and in those book burnings that he did in 1933, along with Freud and anyone else that was Jewish, they burned, his books are going to be burned. By the way, Heinrich Heine, who witnesses a book burning in Bavaria in 1815, he writes, it's really prescient, very prophetic. He says, a nation that burns books will one day, I fear, come to burn people. Interesting. He didn't live to see that one, but a couple generations later, we definitely saw that. Another classic example is Benjamin Disraeli, who was twice prime minister under Queen Elizabeth at the height of the British Empire. And they were very close. You could see this is Queen Elizabeth, who was until the second Queen Victoria, Queen Victoria of England. This is Queen Victoria, who was the longest reigning monarch in British history, one of the longest in the history of Europe, until I think now the current Queen Elizabeth II has now eclipsed her reign. But she, as you can see her walking with her arm, like she's got her arm on Disraeli, weren't romantically involved. It was just like she really relied, she literally leaned on her prime minister, and she used to call him Dizzy. I am sure he did not call her Vicky, but you can see there is Disraeli's, born as a Jew. There you can see where he's buried in St. Matthew's, I think it is, in Buckinghamshire, near his estate. But he's a guy who opted out of his Judaism in order to further his career, because there's no way a Jew at that period of time would have been able to become Prime Minister of England if he identified as a Jew, because there was still very significant restrictions on Jews at this period of time. To illustrate a couple more interesting anecdotes to show you this, the famous Rothschild family that you've all heard of, I mentioned them previously, they came out of the Judengasse, the ghetto in Frankfurt. While they were still confined to the ghetto before Napoleonic Wars, Mayor Amschel, the senior patriarch of the family, had acquired a fairly large amount of wealth for a ghettoized Jew in Europe by dealing in coin dealership and money lending. He was the personal financier for the Landgrave of Hesse, who was the nobleman who ruled the British the German kingdom of Hesse. You remember the Hessians in the American Revolutionary War? They used to make money by renting out their soldiers to people like the British who were fighting against the Americans at the time. When Napoleon comes and liberates the ghettos, he sends his 5 sons to 5 European capitals and creates something today we call international banking. By the way, right out my window over this way, that way, is Rothschild Square. And there's a building they might be familiar with, which was built by Baron Karl von Rothschild, the German Rothschild family. But the Rothschilds in England, very a phenomenally successful family. You can see Lord Lionel Rothschild. Lord Lionel Rothschild, by the way, in 1847 was the first Jew elected to the House of Commons. But because you had to take an oath on a Christian Bible, he had to forswear that. He was not going to swear. I think it was 4 or 5 times he had to say no. He doesn't actually take his seat until 1858, which is 11 years later, when they passed the Act of Jewish Disabilities, which was a special act of parliament that allowed him to swear on a Hebrew Bible. And then he took his seat in Commons, and he didn't speak for the next 20 years. He's the only Jew ever to sit in government and not open his mouth. He was probably too afraid. This was unheard of for Jews to sit in the parliament of what was the greatest world power at the time. It was not only a tremendous honor, but it was a totally new experience. But unlike someone like Disraeli, at least the earlier Rothschilds were loyal Jews. You have Baron Nathan Rothschild, because there's Nathan Lionel, there's several different, they tended to pass on the family name. So this Baron Nathan Rothschild was was the first Jew elected to the House of Lords. And you notice by this period of time, Jews are being successful. And the Rothschilds are an interesting example because they are a family that's able to maintain their Jewish observance, at least during this period of time, yet rise to the pinnacle of European society. To the right is the most interesting of all these characters is Sir Moses Montefiore, who his parents were from Livorno, Italy. That's where he was born, although they were living in England at the time. He was the brother-in-law of Nathan Rothschild. Not this Nathan, I think it's the earlier Nathan Rothschild. His wife's sister was married to Nathan. He was the Rothschild stockbroker. He made a lot of money during Napoleonic Wars, retired at age 41 and lived to be 100 years old. So he had 60 years of retirement. But he was also in the House of Lords at the time, and he had to deal with a lot of difficulties being a Jew in that position at that time. There's a story that's told about another British lord. Remember, the British, when they insult you, they always do it in a very high-handed way. They don't just call you a dirty Jew. Another member of the House of Lords walks up to Moses Montefiore and says, "Sir Moses, let's go to Japan, a place where there are neither pigs nor Jews," which is a pretty nasty thing to say. So Moses Montefiore, who was pretty quick on his feet, he says, "Let's go together so they'll have an example of both of them." I thought that was a great comeback line. But the point is, you can see that these Jews were dealing with this. These are major personalities in European society at the time, major Jews of wealth and power. But this is confronting the Jewish world in general at the time. Every Jew living in Germany and England and France had to deal with, how do we deal with this issue? And they chose to deal with it in many different ways. By the way, the Rothschilds themselves eventually will be largely lured away from Judaism. They had, by the time you get to the late 19th and 20th centuries, they will often allow the men to marry out, but be very strict on the women have to marry Jewish guys in the family. But there's many, many Rothschilds today who are now intermarried and also no longer halachically Jewish. Now, Jews are moving towards, we talked about this a little in the last class, Jews are moving away from their Judaism, which we would expect, by the way, as I mentioned in the last class, why the Jews, the reason why groups of people are hated is because they're different. And as we become more like the majority, the less we should be hated until eventually we assimilate. That's what should happen, as I mentioned in the last class. But we see that anti-Semitism never goes away. And while it may go underground in enlightened Europe in the 19th century and early 20th century, because it was considered uncool to be a racist at the time, we know it doesn't go away. And even some of the greatest minds of enlightened Europe will harbor very negative attitudes towards Jews at a period of time when they're supposed to be accepting us. Here's a great example. This is François-Marie, better known by his pen name Voltaire. And he writes, he's one of the greatest minds, as I said, of the French Revolution. In short, we find neither them only ignorant and barbarous people who have long united the most sordid avarice with the most detestable superstition and the most invincible hatred of every people by whom they are tolerated. By the way, he goes on in that quote to say, nevertheless, they shouldn't be burned. So I think that's the influence of Enlightenment on them. We hate their guts, but we shouldn't mass murder them. Of course, unfortunately, Europe won't stick to that necessarily, and Hitler will go back to burning us too. But this will morph into a new form of anti-Semitism, which will rear its ugly head in the form of Eugen, Karl Dühring, and Wilhelm Marr, who we looked at in the last class. These are the fathers of modern racial anti-Semitism. As I mentioned in the last class, Wilhelm Marr in 1879 will coin the word anti-Semitism, wishing to make hatred of Jews sound more racial and ethnic and less religious, precisely at a time when ethnic and national identity is becoming a big thing. He'll coin that phrase anti-Semitism. But look at what Eugene Karl Dühring writes. And remember, Hitler bases much of his thinking on this man. The question of the Jew is a question of race, is the title of the essay he's writing in. He said the Jewish question would still exist even if every Jew were to turn his back on his religion and join one of our major churches. Yes, I maintain that in that case, the struggle between us and the Jews would make itself felt even more urgent. Unhindered in all sectors of society and political life, I return therefore to it is precisely the baptized Jew who infiltrates furthest most unhindered into all sectors of society and political life. I return therefore to the hypotheses that the Jews are to be defined solely on the basis of race and not on the basis of religion. And this has proved to be a double disaster for Jews, who many will opt out of their Judaism, hoping that they will be accepted by society. In many cases, that will lead to their assimilation and disappearance. And in other cases, it'll lead to them, fast forward to a few decades after he's making this statement, along will come Adolf Hitler with his Nuremberg laws and go hunt down people who aren't even halakhically Jewish anymore, who had one grandparent who was. And we see precisely from the places, as I mentioned in the previous class, where Jews are seemingly trying to engage so openly with the countries that they love, like no one was more German than German Jews, will get the greatest pushback and the greatest explosion of hatred, which is something we need to be aware of as Jews. And this brings us to, as we come to towards the end of the class, a phenomena that we have to keep in our mind as we deal, even today, focusing 100 years after or 200 years after these events, with thinking that somehow minimizing our Jewish identity will somehow maximize our safety within the countries we live. The reality that isn't the case. And that brings me to a theory which I have created on my own, which I call the seismic theory of anti-Semitism, which combines plate tectonics, geology, and Jew hate into a very interesting theory I want to explain, because this is extremely relevant to us today as Jews, especially if you live in the diaspora, which all of you, I think, probably are living outside the land of Israel. Let me explain what this is talking about. So let's talk about geology for a minute, and then I promise I'll make it relevant to Jewish identity and hatred of Jews. You know, the Earth's crust sits on a series of plates. You can see the illustration of the plates in the middle there. The one runs right through the Syrian African Rift Valley, through the Jordan Valley that separates Israel from Jordan of today. It's a fault line. These plates move against each other. You can see some pictures of plates moving. They move this way. They move towards each other, away from each other. But what happens is, because the solid crust of the Earth sits on a molten core, these things move around. There's pressure points. And when the pressure builds and it snaps like a rubber band, if I can actually illustrate, I'm actually sitting at my desk and I can show you. When you take a rubber band and you pull it apart a little and you let go, it releases a little energy. If you pull it apart a lot and you got your nose in the way and let go, it's really going to hurt, because the amount of energy is much greater. In seismology, when there's a minor slip, when pressure starts to build and it slips before it has time to really build up, you get a small earthquake, a 2 on the Richter scale of 3. That's what's called a good earthquake by seismologists, because it releases pressure on the fault line without causing damage. But like with my rubber band, if the fault line goes to sleep for a long time and the pressure builds and 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 builds, when it finally lets go, boom, you're going to get a very serious earthquake. And that's what is going on in Western Europe. In Western Europe, because for about a century or so, the Enlightenment ideals of brotherhood and all, people, it's a great line about, by the way, where you ask, where's God in the Holocaust? I always say, you got to ask first, where was man in the Holocaust? Because the one thing the Holocaust shows is the failure of enlightened society to produce a better world and a more tolerant, open world, because precisely out of the most enlightened country in Western Europe, you have mechanized mass murder on a scale never before seen in human history. In Western Europe, the anti-Semitism had just gone to sleep, but the pressure was building under. It didn't surface in the 19th century, but as again, we talked about this in the previous class, it does surface in one event in 1894, the Dreyfus Affair. And for those of you who remember from the last class, if you were there, I apologize for repeating it again, but it's worth mentioning in the context of this class. We see this is 100 years after Jews are emancipated. And here's the character, a perfect example of the sad consequences of that. Alfred Dreyfus, there's a picture of him. He looks like a real French officer. He's got look at the pince-nez glasses and a little French mustache. He's a completely assimilated Jew from Alsace and Lorraine. Minimum knowledge of Judaism, but a very loyal Frenchman. Remember, France, Jews could join the army and will, of course, be officers immediately. They can rise up to the ranks of officers. Remember, France by 1894 had lost a disastrous war to the Germans, the Franco-Prussian War, when Germany occupied Paris. So the French were smarting from that. That will lead to, of course, World War I, and the French will almost lose that again to the Germans. They managed to stop the Germans at the Battle of the Marne and hold them off till the end of the war. But Dreyfus is a totally loyal Frenchman and a completely assimilated Jew who would go the way of all Jews, to complete assimilation. But France, the government, the army is still deeply anti-Semitic. Dreyfus, the French are smarting from the Franco-Prussian War. They need a scapegoat. Jews are the convenient scapegoat. Dreyfus is framed as a spy using forged evidence that his defense attorney wasn't even allowed to see. He's found guilty in a farce of a trial. And here you can see in the center, the officer breaking his sword, having ripped off the buttons on his uniform. He was publicly humiliated in Paris while the crowd is screaming, "Death to the Jews." Remember, I mentioned in the last class, if you're there, that watching this trial is a 34-year-old totally assimilated Hungarian Jew living in Vienna named Theodor Herzl. And unlike Dreyfus, who seems to be like a deer in the headlights during this and doesn't really figure out what's going on, Herzl sees that this is shocking 100 years after, and he writes in his diary, after Jews are emancipated, they're screaming death to the Jews in Paris. This isn't going to work. The anti-Semitism is not going to go away, which is what is one of the turning points in his life to joining Zionism, the Zionist movement. He didn't found it, but he joins it believing that a Jewish state and a Jewish government will be the solution to anti-Semitism, even though it has not proven to be so. But you can see that for him, for Herzl, it's a powerful wake-up call. For Dreyfus, it is not. The anti-Semitism just goes to sleep. And we'll see that it won't explode in France in such a big way, but fast forward a few decades to Germany. And again, out of the most enlightened country, the symbol of Western Enlightenment, will come the most barbaric evil that we see in the world coming out of such an advanced country, which is an important lesson we have to focus on. Number one for us is the recognition that we should never think for a minute that somehow minimizing our Jewish identity or apologizing for who we are will in any way ever end anti-Semitism. As a matter of fact, my experience is that non-Jews respect Jews more who wear their Judaism proudly. That doesn't mean arrogantly, and it doesn't mean at the expense of loyalty to their host country. But proud Jews, I have seen over and over again, tend to get the respect of non-Jews more, not the Jews who run away from it, which is we see as a double disaster, because A, it will lead to it leads to the greatest explosions of anti-Semitism taking place in places where Jews are the least identified as Jews, most assimilated, or not necessarily least identified, but most comfortable, is something we have to be aware of. But it also brings us back to that fundamental question of how do we reconcile the two? Now, we know this is not a zero-sum game. I put an American flag in there now because that's where the largest diaspora Jewish community is. That's where the Jewish community that is most comfortable is. But that's also, we can see that, like I said, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The assimilation rate amongst non-Orthodox Jews is devastating. The intermarriage rate is 70% when you factor out non-Orthodox Jews. That is a disaster for Jewish continuity, combined with the very low birth rates that the non-Orthodox Jewish world tends to have. And we also see that just as in France, going back to the late 19th century, anti-Semitism is at levels as high as we've ever seen in the history of the United States, where you have things like synagogue shootings that have happened in recent Jewish history that never happened in the US before. Now we have to have guards outside synagogues. We American Jews always felt very safe. And I'm not going to say what will be and what we have to watch out for, but we still have to deal with this question of recognizing that the solution to trying to live comfortably in a country is never to turn our back on our identity in a personal way, in terms of perpetuating the Jewish people, and in terms of minimizing anti-Semitism. That's not the issue. And the challenges we're going to face are how to reach that balance. You guys now know, living in a place like Boca, which is one of the most affluent and comfortable Jewish communities in the United States, that it is very possible to maintain a proud and fully committed Jewish identity while being a fully committed and loyal citizen of America. But those challenges still remain for us to deal with. And I'm going to leave it as a little bit of a cliffhanger now. The real point I want to make, I'm going to save to next week's class, which is going to be on Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox, but specifically the Reform movement in Germany. And out of that experience, we're going to learn some very, very powerful lessons in terms of Jewish identity and what we need to do as Jews to ensure the continuity and the thriving of the Jewish people and Judaism in the world and in the United States, for sure. It's been a pleasure being with you. I'm happy to, by the way, take some questions for a few minutes. Again, there's my website. You're welcome to visit it. You're welcome to contact me through the website. I'm always happy to take questions on the website or take comments. If anyone would like to share anything now, I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes. If you don't, you're welcome to, of course, leave the call if you like. But I'm happy